What if a single moment, a fleeting decision, could alter two lives forever? In a city that never sleeps, where success towers over despair and wealth walks past poverty every day, fate had quietly laid its trap. This is the story of an encounter so unplanned, so seemingly insignificant that no one, not even the people involved, could have predicted how far its ripples would travel. He was a man born into ambition, hardened by challenges, and rewarded with riches beyond imagination. His days were filled with meetings, contracts, numbers, and endless responsibilities, each pushing him further up the ladder of power. Yet, beneath the polished suit, the luxury watch, and the carefully crafted image, there was a void, a hollow space where purpose should have been. On this particular morning, his schedule was packed as always. Calls to be made, deals to close, a world that wouldn't wait. The day began with the hum of a luxury engine, the scent of leather seats, and the weight of yet another high-stakes negotiation hanging over his head. Stepping out of his car, he was greeted by the chaos of the city. Honking horns, hurried footsteps, and the relentless rhythm of life. But the city has layers. Layers you only notice if you stop long enough to look. While some gaze up at skyscrapers in awe, others never lift their eyes from the ground. Just outside the gleaming glass doors of an exclusive restaurant sat a man whose world couldn't have been more different. He had no meetings to attend, no contracts to sign, and no luxuries to shield him from the cold reality of his existence. His possessions were few: a faded backpack, a tattered book, and a small cup with a smattering of coins. His clothes were worn and frayed, his face etched with the kind of fatigue that only comes from fighting battles no one sees. But there was something in his posture, something quiet, dignified, even defiant, as though he refused to let his circumstances define him entirely. The billionaire, phone pressed to his ear, walked toward the restaurant without a second thought. His mind raced with numbers and strategies, his words sharp and decisive as he negotiated another lucrative deal. To him, the man by the door was barely a shadow, another part of the city's background noise. But something he couldn't quite explain, made him glance sideways. A momentary pause, a flicker of curiosity. It wasn't pity or guilt. It wasn't even compassion. It was a simple, unshakable feeling that he needed to look again. And so, he did. The man wasn't begging. He wasn't even paying attention to the passers-by. His focus was on the book in his hands. A book so old its spine was cracked, its pages barely holding together. The billionaire noticed the way he turned each page carefully, as though the words held a secret too precious to rush. It wasn't the usual image of homelessness. There was no outstretched hand, no signboard pleading for help. There was only a man and his thoughts, as though he'd found a way to escape the harshness of his surroundings, even if just for a moment. For reasons he couldn't explain, the billionaire stopped mid-sentence. He ended the call abruptly, ignoring the protests on the other end of the line. He stood there for a moment, torn between the urgency of his world and the pull of something he couldn't name. What was it about this man that caught his attention? Was it the quiet dignity? The contradiction of intellect amidst hardship? Or was it something deeper, something neither man could see but both were about to discover? Life has a way of disguising its most profound moments as ordinary. A glance, a pause, a seemingly insignificant choice. This was one of those moments, a crossroads disguised as nothing more than two men occupying the same space. What happened next would challenge their perceptions of success, failure, and everything in between. It would blur the lines between the one who gives and the one who receives, and it would leave neither man unchanged. This was the beginning of something neither had planned, but both would carry with them for the rest of their lives. He was a man who had built an empire from the ground up, a billionaire whose name was synonymous with power and success. To the world, he was untouchable, an icon of ambition, innovation, and relentless determination. His days were meticulously scheduled, each moment accounted for, each decision a stepping stone to further greatness. Yet, beneath the surface, something gnawed at him. His wealth had bought him luxury, but not fulfillment. The sprawling estates, private jets, and award-winning businesses had long since lost their charm. Each day blurred into the next, the victories feeling hollow, the applause fading too quickly. At night, alone in his penthouse overlooking the city, he often wondered, what's the point of having it all if it doesn't feel like enough? This morning was no different. The billionaire, clad in a custom-tailored suit, emerged from his luxury car with purpose in his stride. A phone call consumed his attention, his voice sharp and commanding as he negotiated yet another deal. To everyone around him, he was the epitome of control, a man who had mastered the art of success. But beneath the facade, there was a restlessness he couldn't shake, a feeling that something was missing, something he couldn't name. Meanwhile, just a few feet away, another man sat in stark contrast. The sidewalk was his home, the city his backdrop. His clothes, frayed and faded, told the story of years spent on the margins. Yet his posture was far from defeated. Seated on a worn blanket, he held a tattered book in his hands, turning its pages with a care that suggested the words meant more to him than the coins in his cup. Who was this man? To the passers-by, he was invisible, a blur in the chaos of the city, an inconvenient reminder of life's fragility. But his story was far more complex than the surface suggested. Once upon a time, he had been someone, a professional with dreams, a family, and a purpose. He had walked the same streets in a different life, dressed in crisp shirts and polished shoes. But life, unpredictable and unforgiving, had taken a turn. A series of misfortunes, a layoff, an illness, the loss of a loved one, had unraveled everything he had worked for. The descent had been slow but steady. One missed payment led to another, and soon, the walls of stability crumbled. His support system faded, his friends disappeared, and the world seemed to move on without him. Now, he existed on the fringes, surviving day to day, carrying with him only the remnants of a life once lived. A faded backpack, a tattered book, and the resilience to keep going despite it all. But this man was no ordinary figure. Beneath the layers of hardship lay a mind sharp and curious, a talent untouched by time or circumstance. The book he held wasn't just a distraction. It was a lifeline, a source of inspiration, a testament to the dreams he refused to let die. And though the world had forgotten him, he had not forgotten himself. The billionaire, lost in his thoughts and negotiations, might have walked past him like everyone else. But today, something caught his eye. The book in the homeless man's hands was no ordinary one. Its cover was worn, its spine cracked, but it had an unmistakable aura of importance. The billionaire's pace slowed as his gaze lingered. For a moment, the world around them seemed to pause. What was it about this man that drew his attention? Was it the book? The way he handled it with care and reverence? Or was it something deeper? A glimpse of humanity that mirrored his own unspoken discontent? The homeless man, oblivious to the attention, continued to read. His lips moved slightly as though silently reciting the words. There was a focus in his eyes, a quiet intensity that suggested he was somewhere far beyond the noisy streets. And then there was the notebook, an old, weathered thing lying beside him. Its pages were filled with sketches, intricate and detailed, each line drawn with precision and purpose. Some were of the city, capturing its chaos and beauty in equal measure. Others seemed abstract, as if inspired by a world only he could see. The billionaire's curiosity deepened. He couldn't explain it, but something about this man felt different. He wasn't like the others who begged for spare change or shuffled aimlessly through the streets. There was a quiet dignity about him, a sense of purpose that defied his circumstances. And so, the stage was set. Two men, from opposite ends of life's spectrum, drawn together by forces neither could understand. One had everything but felt empty. The other had nothing but carried within him a spark that refused to be extinguished. In this moment, their worlds were about to collide. And what began as a simple glance would soon unravel into a story that neither man could have anticipated. A story of redemption, connection, and the unexpected power of second chances. The morning was turning out to be more frustrating than the billionaire had anticipated. The deal he had been negotiating for weeks seemed to be unraveling, and his phone call had done little to salvage it. His polished demeanor faltered as he ended the call, shoving his phone into his pocket with a hint of irritation. As he approached the entrance of the high-end restaurant, he cradled an untouched coffee in one hand. It was one of those expensive, custom brews that most people wouldn't think twice about savoring. But for him, it was merely a routine purchase, another detail in his meticulously crafted life. With a sharp sigh, he tossed the nearly full cup into the nearby trash can, his mind already preoccupied with the next move he needed to make to save the deal. To anyone passing by, it was just another small act of wastefulness, but to the man sitting a few feet away on the sidewalk, it was something more. The homeless man, who had been quietly observing the world around him, noticed the discarded cup. With a calm and deliberate motion, he stood up, walked over to the trash can, and retrieved it. It wasn't an act of desperation or shame, but one of quiet resourcefulness. He took a napkin from his pocket, carefully wiped the rim, and inspected the contents. The billionaire, catching the movement out of the corner of his eye, paused. He turned slightly, watching as the man sat back down, the cup now clean and resting beside him. It was the man's next words that stopped him in his tracks. "Sometimes even trash has value," the homeless man said, his voice steady and matter-of-fact, as though he were stating an obvious truth. The billionaire blinked, caught off guard. For a moment, he wasn't sure if he'd heard correctly. Who was this man, sitting there with nothing, yet speaking with such quiet conviction? He hesitated, then took a step closer. "What did you say?" he asked, his tone more curious than confrontational. The man looked up, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "Trash," he repeated, lifting the cup slightly. "It's all about perspective. What's worthless to one person might be a lifeline to another." The billionaire frowned, not out of annoyance, but out of thought. There was something disarming about the man's words, the way he spoke with a calm confidence that didn't match his appearance. "That's an interesting perspective," the billionaire replied, folding his arms. "But you think cleaning a used coffee cup gives it value?" The man smiled faintly, setting the cup down beside him. "Not the cup itself," he said, "but the act of seeing value where others don't, that's what matters. It's the principle." The billionaire studied him for a moment, intrigued despite himself. There was a sharpness in the man's eyes, a glimmer of intelligence that hinted at a story far more complex than his outward circumstances suggested. "You talk like someone who's seen both sides of the coin," the billionaire said, almost as a challenge. The homeless man chuckled softly. "Maybe I have," he replied, gesturing to the empty spot beside him. "Why don't you sit down? It's not every day someone like you stops to listen." For reasons he couldn't quite explain, the billionaire found himself lowering onto the edge of the sidewalk, his expensive suit brushing against the worn concrete. It was an odd sight, two men from entirely different worlds, sitting side by side in the middle of a bustling city. "So, what's your story?" the billionaire asked, leaning back slightly. The homeless man didn't answer right away. Instead, he picked up the tattered book he had been reading earlier, holding it up for the billionaire to see. It was an old, well-worn classic, its cover faded and pages yellowed. "This," he said, tapping the book gently, "is my story, or at least, it's part of it. You'd be surprised how much a person can learn from the words of those who came before us." The billionaire raised an eyebrow. "A fan of literature, huh?" The man nodded. "Literature, art, philosophy, anything that makes you think. It's funny, isn't it? How you can lose everything material, but the things you've learned, the things you've felt, they stay with you. They're the real wealth." For a moment, the billionaire was silent, absorbing the man's words. He couldn't remember the last time he'd heard someone speak with such conviction, such genuine passion. "You sound like someone who's had more than his fair share of hard times," the billionaire finally said. The man shrugged, his smile faint but genuine. "Hard times teach you what really matters," he said, "but they also show you what you're made of." The billionaire found himself nodding, a rare moment of agreement with a stranger who, by all appearances, had nothing in common with him. And yet, there was something about this man that felt familiar. As their conversation continued, the world around them seemed to fade. The bustling city, the ringing phones, the constant demands of life. All of it felt distant, unimportant. In that moment, it was just two men, sharing a connection that neither could have anticipated. And though the billionaire didn't know it yet, this encounter would change everything, not just for the homeless man, but for himself as well. The billionaire hadn't expected to feel a connection, let alone an unexpected bond, with a man living on the streets. But as the minutes ticked by, something began to shift inside him. Perhaps it was the man's calm demeanor, his unassuming wisdom, or the odd sense of relief that came with talking to someone who had no agenda. The weight of his corporate world, with its relentless demands, seemed to lift for just a moment. "Come on," the billionaire finally said, his voice softer than he expected. "You must be hungry. I know a place not far from here." The homeless man looked at him, an eyebrow slightly raised, as if surprised. "A meal? You're offering me a meal?" The billionaire nodded, motioning toward the nearby restaurant. "I'm not a saint, if that's what you're thinking. Just thought I'd share a bit of my wealth for once." The homeless man stood slowly, taking his time. There was a grace in his movements that defied the disheveled exterior. He followed the billionaire into the restaurant, which felt out of place for him. A place where the finest tastes and polished surfaces surrounded them. As they sat at a table, the homeless man settled in, removing his jacket and carefully placing it beside him. He looked around, taking in the decor, but his demeanor remained composed. "This isn't exactly my usual scene," the homeless man admitted with a slight chuckle. "But I'll make do." The billionaire studied him intently. There was something in the man's eyes, a sharpness that suggested a mind far beyond what his circumstances would have indicated. They made small talk for a few moments, and then the conversation turned more philosophical. "I've been thinking," the billionaire said, leaning back in his chair, his eyes narrowed as he took a sip of wine. "I've got everything I could ever want. Wealth, status, a life that people envy, but it feels like I'm missing something. I keep chasing after success, but the more I get, the emptier it feels." The homeless man listened intently, nodding slowly. "I know exactly what you mean. I used to chase success too. I used to have everything, money, a career, a future, but I lost it all. Life has a way of doing that." The billionaire blinked, taken aback by the man's candidness. "What happened?" he asked, genuinely curious. The homeless man's gaze softened, and he leaned forward, his voice quieter now. "Life, people, choices. I was a lawyer once, had a great career, a family, the works. But one bad decision, one moment of weakness, and it all came crashing down. I was too proud to ask for help, too stubborn to see the warning signs." As the man spoke, brief flashes of his past began to surface, quick, almost imperceptible glimpses of a life long gone. In one flash, he stood in a high-rise office, wearing a tailored suit, smiling as he held a glass of champagne at a celebration. In the next, he was sitting in a courtroom, arguing fiercely, his confidence shining. But then, another image flickered, a moment of intense regret, standing in front of a closed door, a resignation letter in his hand. The billionaire could see the weight in his eyes, the depth of pain that came with loss. But there was something else that intrigued him. Even now, as a man without a home, the homeless man still carried that same fire, that same intensity. "So, what did you do after that?" the billionaire asked, almost as if the answer was something he needed to know. The homeless man smiled faintly. "I kept living, one day at a time. You'd be surprised how much you can learn about life when you have nothing but time to think." For a moment, there was silence between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. The billionaire shifted in his seat, his mind whirring. He was used to being the one who had all the answers, the one who made the decisions. But now, it felt as though he were sitting across from someone who had figured out what really mattered, someone who had seen through the illusion of success. And then, just as the conversation seemed to reach a natural pause, the homeless man spoke again. "You know," he said, taking a napkin and pulling out a pen from his jacket pocket, "sometimes, the answers are right in front of you. You just need to look at them differently." The billionaire watched in quiet astonishment as the man began sketching something on the napkin, a detailed, almost perfect portrait of a person. It was as if the lines flowed from his hand effortlessly, capturing something in the likeness of the subject that the billionaire couldn't quite grasp. The homeless man finished the sketch with a flourish and slid the napkin across the table. "There," he said. "It's not much, but I've always had an eye for detail." The billionaire stared at the portrait, his mind racing. How could someone who had lost everything still possess this kind of skill? And more importantly, what could it mean for his own problems? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of his phone buzzing in his pocket. He pulled it out and glanced at the screen, his heart sinking. Another failed business deal. Another public backlash. His company was facing a crisis, and the media was already circling. For a brief moment, everything around him felt distant. The restaurant, the luxurious meal, the man sitting across from him, they all seemed to fade away. His world, the one he had built and thought was unshakable, was crumbling. "What do you think I should do?" the billionaire asked, his voice barely above a. The homeless man looked at him, his eyes steady. "It's not about what you have. It's about what you can give." The billionaire blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" The homeless man smiled slightly. "You're holding on to something that's already slipping away. Maybe it's time to let go and build something new. You can't keep fixing something that's broken." The words resonated with the billionaire more than he wanted to admit. It wasn't the advice he had expected from someone in his position, but it was the kind of truth he'd been avoiding for years. It was the spark he needed, a reminder that even in moments of total loss, there could be a new beginning. And as he looked back at the homeless man, he realized that this encounter had already begun to change him in ways that he couldn't yet fully understand. But one thing was certain. He was no longer the same man who had walked into the restaurant just an hour ago. As the conversation between the billionaire and the homeless man continued, something inside the billionaire shifted. The weight of his failed business deals, the crushing pressure of being at the top, suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the moment unfolding before him. He was no longer just a businessman trying to solve problems with money or power. He was a man facing something much deeper, something that had eluded him for years. Purpose. There, across the table, sat a man who had experienced both success and failure. Someone who had lived through the kind of pain the billionaire couldn't fathom, yet still held an inexplicable grace. And in that moment, something sparked inside the billionaire. A sudden clarity, an instinct to offer the homeless man something more than just a meal. The billionaire shifted in his seat, looking directly into the homeless man's eyes, his voice calm but filled with an earnestness he had never felt before. "What if I could offer you something else?" The billionaire paused, as if to measure the weight of his words. "What if I could offer you a job? Not a handout, but an opportunity. A chance to work alongside me, to share your perspective. I can't promise you everything, but I can promise that I'll take you seriously." The homeless man stared back, his expression unreadable. There was a long silence between them, the sound of the restaurant's soft hum filling the void. The billionaire couldn't tell if the man was shocked, suspicious, or maybe even reluctant. Finally, the homeless man spoke, his voice soft but filled with a mixture of uncertainty and disbelief. "You want to offer me a job? A man like me?" He shook his head slightly, as if unsure whether he should laugh or take the offer seriously. "I don't even know where to begin. I've been on the streets for years. I'm not the person you think I am." The billionaire's gaze softened. He could hear the hesitation in the man's voice, the self-doubt that had been ingrained in him after so many years of hardship. But there was something about the man's resilience, his strength despite everything, that called to him. "I'm not asking you to be someone else," the billionaire said quietly. "I'm asking you to be yourself. You've been through more than I could imagine. And maybe that's what I need in my life right now. Someone who can see things differently, someone who can remind me of what really matters. You don't have to doubt your worth. I see something in you." The homeless man remained silent, his hands clenched slightly, a nervous energy radiating from him. He looked down at the table for a moment, his mind racing. He had spent so many years fighting against the world, and now this billionaire, this man of power and wealth, was offering him something so rare, so completely unexpected. "Why me?" the homeless man asked quietly, still unsure of his own place in this moment. "Why would you offer me something like this when you could choose anyone else?" The billionaire leaned in, his voice earnest. "Because, right now, You're the only person who's made me see things differently. You've made me realize that there's more to life than just winning or losing business deals. It's about understanding the value of people, of their stories. And I think you could teach me something I don't even know I need to learn." There was a long pause as the homeless man sat, clearly wrestling with the offer. He could hardly believe what he was hearing. Was it possible? Could he really be given a chance to change his life? Could he return to a world he had left behind so long ago? But the uncertainty didn't last long. Slowly, almost hesitantly, the homeless man nodded. "I don't know if I can do this," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "I've been away from that world for too long. I don't even have the confidence I once had." The billionaire smiled, a flicker of understanding crossing his face. "You don't need to have it all figured out. We'll take it one step at a time. But I believe in you." The words hung in the air like a challenge, a promise, and an unspoken understanding. But before either man could say anything more, the billionaire's phone buzzed again, pulling him back to reality. He glanced at the screen, a series of missed calls and urgent emails. His team was calling about the ongoing crisis. The pressure was mounting, and the external forces that shaped his world were pushing him harder than ever. But the moment felt different now. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel completely consumed by the business world. The homeless man's offer of a fresh perspective, his quiet wisdom, had somehow grounded him. As the billionaire checked his phone, he heard a voice in the distance. A voice he had long since tuned out, the voice of his trusted business partner, Mark. He approached their table with a confident stride, clearly unbothered by the unconventional setting. "Hey, John," Mark said, addressing the billionaire with a mix of familiarity and authority. "We need to talk. This whole situation is spiraling, and we need to figure out a plan fast. The investors are getting restless, and if we don't do something about the fallout soon, it'll be too late." The billionaire glanced up, his gaze meeting Mark's, but there was something different in his eyes now. A shift had taken place, something Mark couldn't see. He saw only the billionaire's external struggle, the challenges that loomed. "Give me a moment, Mark," the billionaire said, his voice steady. "I'll be right there." Mark hesitated, glancing at the homeless man sitting across from the billionaire, then back at his partner, clearly confused. But the billionaire was no longer interested in playing by the same rules. His mind was elsewhere, contemplating something far more meaningful than his business empire. "I'll handle it," the billionaire added, his tone final. As Mark walked away, the billionaire's attention returned to the man across from him. There was a moment of quiet understanding between them, a shared bond forged not through wealth or status, but through a human connection that transcended everything. The homeless man nodded, a flicker of hope returning to his eyes. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel invisible. He felt seen. And for the billionaire, the weight of his decisions had never been so clear. A new chapter was about to begin, one that could change both their lives in ways they couldn't yet imagine. As time passes, the homeless man begins to thrive in his new role, surprising everyone around him. His sharp intellect, often overlooked by society, now comes to the forefront. In the fast-paced environment of the billionaire's company, he quickly identifies opportunities others missed. What seemed like simple observations at first turn into innovative solutions. His first few days may have been full of small, seemingly insignificant wins, but soon those wins snowball into noticeable success. One day, during a critical strategy meeting, the homeless man speaks up. His voice, calm and steady, cuts through the noise of boardroom chatter. He suggests an idea, a new marketing strategy that no one had considered before. At first, the room goes quiet. The billionaire's trusted executives exchange skeptical glances. But the man's idea, though unconventional, proves brilliant. The company begins to see an unexpected boost in revenue, and that's just the beginning. Suddenly, the homeless man's place in the company is no longer questioned. He is seen for his ideas, his creativity, his vision. People who once ignored him now seek his advice. Colleagues who once dismissed him now ask for his guidance. The homeless man, who had once been invisible, had found his purpose. Meanwhile, the billionaire watches in awe. As the homeless man's influence grows, so does the billionaire's introspection. Something shifts within him. The empty, hollow feeling that had gnawed him for so long starts to fade. The success of his company doesn't seem to matter as much anymore. What he sees in the homeless man is not just brilliance or opportunity. It's something more profound: humanity. The more time they spend together, the more the billionaire begins to understand what he'd been missing. He no longer feels the drive for wealth, power, or status that once consumed him. Instead, he feels a deep sense of fulfillment, something money couldn't provide. Their bond strengthens, and the billionaire finds himself opening up about his own life, about the loneliness he often feels, the pressure of his world, the things he's lost in the pursuit of success. The homeless man listens patiently, offering perspectives that the billionaire had never considered. They start to discuss everything, from the simple joys of life to the complex questions about success, failure, and purpose. In these quiet moments, the billionaire realizes that his wealth, his power, his empire, none of it holds the same weight anymore. The most valuable thing he has now is connection. Real, meaningful connection with others. The homeless man, who once had nothing, has shown him that the greatest riches in life are not material. They are human. The homeless man, too, changes. No longer just a figure in the background, he starts to flourish. The same man who once sat on the streets with no direction now thrives in the world he never thought he'd be part of. He becomes a mentor, not just in the workplace, but in life. He begins to inspire others, teaching them that it's not where you come from, but where you're willing to go that matters. He shares his story of losing it all, of finding the strength to rebuild, and of realizing that sometimes the greatest success comes from the most unexpected places. Through all of this, the billionaire begins to change, too. He no longer seeks to climb higher or accumulate more. Instead, he starts looking for ways to lift others up, to give people opportunities, to help them reach their potential. He learns that it's not about how much you have, but how much you give. And in giving, he finds a kind of fulfillment that no amount of money ever brought him. The company, under the leadership of both men, begins to flourish in a way it never had before. The focus is no longer just on profits, it's on people. The employees are not just workers, they are individuals with unique stories and potential. The company's success is now measured not only in revenue but in the impact it has on the lives of its people. What started as a chance encounter, a moment of unexpected connection, has transformed both men's lives. The homeless man, who once had nothing, has not only regained his place in the world but has also found his calling. The billionaire, who once had everything, has learned that the true riches in life lie in human connection, empathy, and the willingness to share what you have with others. Both men have undergone transformations, not just in their circumstances, but in their hearts. And in that transformation, they found a truth that neither could have expected: that sometimes the most life-changing moments come when we least expect them, and they come from the most unlikely sources. As the final moments of the story unfold, everything that has been building toward this climax comes to fruition. The billionaire, now a different man, prepares to close a major business deal that could elevate his company to new heights. The air is thick with anticipation as the final presentation is about to take place. The conference room is filled with executives, investors, and industry leaders, all eagerly awaiting the outcome. But this time, the billionaire doesn't take full credit. As he begins his speech, he pauses, looking directly at the homeless man who's standing in the corner, quietly observing the room. The billionaire's voice carries a deep sense of gratitude as he addresses the crowd. "I stand before you today not just as the leader of this company, but as someone who has been reminded of the most important thing of all," he says, his words resonating with the weight of his journey. This deal, this moment, would not have been possible without the wisdom and perspective of someone who, just a few months ago, was considered invisible by most. He taught me something I had forgotten: that success is not just about profit, it's about people. And for that, I will be forever grateful. The room falls silent as the homeless man, once dismissed as nothing more than an afterthought, is recognized as a crucial player in the company's success. His input, his ideas, have been instrumental in turning things around. It's clear that this moment is not just about a business deal. It's about acknowledging the power of human connection and insight. As the applause dies down, the billionaire turns to the homeless man, his eyes filled with a deep sense of respect and emotion. "You didn't just save my business," he says, his voice thick with gratitude. "You reminded me of what truly matters, the things money can't buy. You showed me that life isn't about the deals we close or the wealth we accumulate. It's about the people we meet along the way and the difference we can make in their lives." The homeless man, overwhelmed by the recognition, looks at the billionaire with a mixture of disbelief and appreciation. For the first time in a long while, he feels seen, not as a man without a home, but as someone who has the potential to make a real impact. The billionaire continues, "I want you to know that this isn't just a one-time thing. I'm offering you a permanent position with the company, not just as an advisor, but as a leader. You have a place here because you've earned it. And if you ever want to rebuild your life outside of work, I'll be here to support you in whatever way you need." It's a moment that feels like a dream to the homeless man. He never expected anything like this, especially not from a world that had cast him aside so easily. He struggles to find the right words, but in the end, all he can say is, "Thank you." There's an emotional pause as the two men stand there, the magnitude of the moment settling in. The billionaire extends his hand, not as a superior, but as a friend. The homeless man shakes it, his grip firm and full of gratitude. In this simple exchange, both men understand that their lives have been changed forever, not just by the business deal, but by the bond they've formed. In that moment, it becomes clear that this story is not about a homeless man saving a billionaire's business, but about how the two of them saved each other. The billionaire's success was no longer measured in money, but in the transformation of his own heart, his perspective on life, and the relationships he had built. And for the homeless man, it was not just a job he had been given. It was a second chance, a renewed sense of purpose, and the chance to rebuild not just his life, but his sense of dignity. As the two of them leave the room together, side by side, the story comes full circle. What started as an unexpected encounter between two vastly different worlds has now become a partnership built on respect, empathy, and shared understanding. The billionaire and the homeless man have both found something they never expected: a deeper sense of fulfillment, a life enriched by meaningful connections, and a future filled with possibilities. The final shot shows them walking out of the building, the city skyline behind them, a symbol of the vast world they have yet to explore together. And in that simple image, we see the powerful message that sometimes the most life-changing encounters happen when we least expect them, and they come from the most unexpected places. Sometimes, the most valuable lessons come from the most unexpected places. What would you do if you had the power to change someone's life? What if the person who could change yours is closer than you think? It's not just about what we achieve. It's about who we become and the lives we touch along the way. If this story moved you, share your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done in the billionaire's shoes? And if this tale touched your heart, share it with someone who might need a little inspiration today. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories that remind us of the power of connection and change. Sometimes, a simple act of kindness can change everything. What change will you make today?